In the interest of time, we are going to skip the intro slides, but feel free to refer back to the previous presentations for a broader introduction. Again, thank you everybody for having me today. So the CLCPA has a goal to reduce 85% of GHG emissions by 2050. Here you see the percentage of which sectors are responsible for emissions in New York State. We'll be talking about waste and industry today, which together are the third largest sector, but individually are the fourth and fifth in respective size. Next slide. So I'm sure most of us on this call already know that we have a waste problem. A significant challenge is just how we refer to materials going to landfill and calling it waste in the first place. From a circular economy perspective, we must remember that even if an item no longer has use to us, it has embodied energy. New Yorkers are sending about 5 pounds of material a day on average to landfill or incineration, which equates to about 18 million tons of municipal solid waste a year, which is an incredible amount. Of the emissions calculated, 78% is attributed to the methane and other GHG emissions coming from landfill and other end-of-life facilities, and about 15% of that is attributed to wastewater treatment facilities. So important to note here, per the EPA, if you were to conduct a GHG inventory on a life cycle basis, which takes into account the energy and fuel consumed in the production of all the products and packaging that becomes waste, then that 12% actually jumps to a 42%. Finally, to note, GHG emissions, as you see here, from the US plastics industry are on track to surpass emissions from coal by 2030. Next slide. Of all the material going to landfill, organics are the easiest and most resource dense, critical to the reduction of GHG, diversion of organic waste from landfills and incineration. We need this to be in place by 2030. These are the recommendations I should have noted from the Climate Council. We passed a law in 2019 to require food producers of over 2 tons of food waste a week to start diverting that food waste. The plan recommends expanding this existing law to all producers of food waste. There are no financial incentives right now to wasting any material. So as you see in the next bullet, we need to require a surcharge or a fee per ton for sending this material to landfill. Finally, the DEC does have funding available right now specifically for food relief generators, organic recycling facilities, municipalities, and food scrap generators. Expanding these programs to increase the funding and improving accessibility would ensure that food that is edible is transported to the 2.2 million New Yorkers that are food insecure. Next slide. The plan outlines that we must phase out single-use plastics. We must reduce the demand of these products to see the actual production decrease. Also, we need about 6% of the material in landfill is textile waste, and only about 15% of it is being reused or recycled. So in order to reduce significant GHG emissions, the plan recommends developing a comprehensive textile recycling program. It also recommends enacting by request only legislation. This is a good start to phasing out single-use items where a business only offers you an item if you specifically ask for it. The plan also outlines enacting expanded bottle deposit legislation. This is a 40-year system with proven results in taking materials, cleaning them, and they have a very high recyclable rate. Also critical to reduction and recommended here is the implementation of accessible, easy reuse systems across all sectors. The plan proposes to research, develop, and implement reusable systems. Lastly, the plan also calls for expanded outreach and education for recycling and calls for increased investment in programs located in multifamily buildings and public housing programs. These have been underutilized but also underfunded. The plan also calls for enforcement officers to ensure that these programs are being used. Next slide. So also how to get there, the plan recommends an expanded extender producer responsibility policy. For those of you that haven't heard that, it's a model where producers or manufacturers of a product are financially responsible for the end of life of that and the cost of the end of life of that product. The plan calls for complete EPR framework legislation or alternatively for expanding EPR for items of concern like paper and packaging and also solar panels. The plan also calls for optimizing anaerobic digestion, or AD, and co-digestion, which is a method to increase methane production from low-yielding or difficult to digest materials. We see this at wastewater resource recovery facilities. That's one method that combine sludge and food waste. Also included in the plan is requiring reclamation or destruction of refrigerants, some that still have high global warming potential, from appliances at end of life, and institute requirements for verification and reporting. It also recommends enacting EPR for those refrigerant containing appliances. Next slide. The plan also recommends the support of expanding many different end markets. That includes recyclables, as well as compost, digestate, recycled aggregate, and building deconstruction materials. Critical to the reuse of building materials is updating the state procurement policies. There's over 70 government agencies. That's a tremendous opportunity to shift the market. The plan proposes enhancing the specs to move from recommending to requiring the use of recycled items. And another related recommendation is to require a minimal level of recycled content on the most commonly purchased items and products from the government. The plan also recommends evaluating the use of generated fuels, electricity, and other energy produced from biogas for essential needs during the transition to electrification. We'll talk about this. The evaluation is certainly needed, but caution should be taken to avoid biogas use intentionally or inadvertently leading to the extended use of fossil fuels. Next slide. So what are the benefits? There are long-term economic benefits from reducing waste. The less waste there is, the less cost of collection and processing, that all will be reduced. There are major health benefits from decreasing waste production, as well as significant potential for dramatic increase in employment for good paying reuse and recycling jobs. Next slide. Specific to the research and development needs outlined by the Climate Council, we need to expand those R&D funding for universities. Currently, there's $16 million projected in the 2023 budget for 4 universities, SUNY ESF, where I work, being one of them. You can see the number of items that are listed currently under some of those expansion dollars. Exploring those end markets is critical. Conducting a market study of the quantity and characteristics of both organics and municipal solid waste is imperative. One of the major challenges of reducing our waste is knowing exactly what it is composed of. There are 57 counties in New York State, and every single one of them has a little bit of a different system for analyzing data. So we must work to standardize those. Also, we need to conduct a feasibility of the reusable models and the deposit-driven system so that we can increase them and implement them. Finally, another research area to look at the difficult to manage end of life materials, specifically things like solar panels, but also various refrigerants. Finally, an increase in the expansion of outreach and education dollars are needed to communicate these methods more broadly across the state. Next slide. Additional research also needs to be done around the extent and the impact of co-pollutants and emerging contaminants, as well as need to conduct a research study with comprehensive profiles of nitrous oxide and other landfill and WRRF emissions that will, as you see here, quantify fugitive emissions, expand research on emerging fugitive emissions, and monitoring techniques and emerging technologies, as well as outline the use for gas during transition to statewide electrification. Next slide. So in the interest of time, I won't go through all of these, but we have outlined the best areas to focus on public comments here. And you guys are all experts now from being on these presentations, so you'll have these slides to review. But overall, our thinking is really to address and redesign the entire waste hierarchy by tackling the lack of regulations on waste. So holding the producers in the waste industry responsible and addressing the overproduction of materials. You'll see on this slide the specific goal setting around 100% food waste diversion target by 2050, as well as increasing the recycling rate to 50%. It's currently at 18%. We know that in order to hit those numbers, recycling systems, as well as the organic systems, may need to be redesigned and will require additional investment. Next slide and last slide. We support the legislation to move the waste hierarchy needle. To note on this slide, we support, as mentioned, the expansion of the bottle bill, specifically to include additional materials like wine and beer bottles, and also to increase the return rate from 5 cents to 10 cents to the consumer. We also would love to see single-use plastic bans, and we recommend this, like the bag ban and Governor Hochul's recent SUNY-wide plastic ban. These are the type of laws that work. Finally, listed here is to support the ban for any increase or use of waste incineration for electricity generation. How'd I do on time? I think that's the last slide. There we go. So we want to transition now. I didn't do an intro, but I think everybody already knows him. So
hi,
I'll kick it over to Alan.
Okay, so the second half of today's discussion is about the industrial sector. It makes up 9% of New York's greenhouse gas emissions. The biggest emitters are listed here. I want to note the three on the left: cement, metals, and glass. The state can exert some control over them. I'll talk about that a little later. Also note emerging emitters, specifically cryptocurrency mining. The scoping plan does not address this potentially disastrous greenhouse gas emissions source. Next slide, please. The scoping plan says that for industry, we can't use regulations. If we do, they can just leave the state and they take their pollution with them. In bureaucraties, the term for this is leakage. Instead, we have to use incentives, which means basically you give them a lot of money with strings attached. And if that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, you're not alone. So we need to align these incentives toward pushing toward three basic technological goals. First, increase energy efficiency. Second, go electric whenever possible, using zero carbon fuels like green hydrogen when you can't go electric. And third, sequester carbon, either in the product or in the ground. And that's in red because it's a false solution. We'll talk about that in a bit. Two broader goals we want to push is growing New York's green economy and growing the state's green workforce with an emphasis on recruiting from disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So how do we get there? First, we need to know who's polluting and how much. That's the baseline kind of benchmarking that every sector requires. Kate talked about that for waste. New York already collects greenhouse gas emissions data on large emitters, but we need to broaden the scope to all significant emitters. California and the EPA have an online reporting system, and we just need to use something similar. Second, we should fund programs both for making industries more efficient and less carbon intensive and for green job training. We should provide engineering support to assure industries that these programs will actually work and that manufacturing processes won't be interrupted. We'll want to prioritize industries that have the biggest polluting impact on disadvantaged communities, and we should prioritize these communities when recruiting for green jobs. Next slide. Third, we need to incentivize industries to grow green. Businesses could get tax credits, project funding, or even subsidized labor if they develop a green supply chain in state, make capital investments in state, hire workers for green jobs, or do green research and development. The state should develop, move on. Okay, yeah, the state should develop procurement policies to grow the market for green products. We're talking mostly concrete and steel, but glass and foam insulation are major players also. Manufacturers can green their product materials by using more electricity or zero emissions energy in manufacturing, making their manufacturing process more energy efficient, using greener raw materials, or sequestering carbon either in the product itself or by carbon capture and storage, which again, I'll be discussing later. The scoping plan says that the state should develop low carbon standards for materials with high embedded carbon. And that phrase means manufacturing them generates a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. And it should incentivize builders to use only materials that meet that standard. Note that the scoping plan says nothing about requirements. California requires building materials to meet low carbon standards. Next. So for disadvantaged communities, they'll benefit from prioritizing decarbonization in industries that are the biggest polluters in their communities, prioritizing disadvantaged communities when recruiting to train and employ the new green workforce also. But the Climate Justice Working Group doesn't trust carbon capture and storage, not anywhere, let alone disadvantaged communities. They also suggest that BIPOC representatives be included in planning for developmental programs to ensure their unique perspectives are represented. Next. So the industrial sector is the only sector which may not be able to decrease its greenhouse gas emissions to target, even with research and development advances. For this reason, R&D in this sector is going to have to be prioritized. You have to target technologies which are the cheapest, have the highest impact on greenhouse gas reduction, meet environmental justice criteria, and are easily scalable. So targets would include improving the efficiency of industrial processes and electrifying industrial processes whenever possible. Also sequestering carbon into manufactured materials. Next and last slide. So if you're commenting on this area, we suggest the following. Push for strict reporting requirements of all industrial greenhouse gas emitters. Fund industrial efficiency and decarbonization programs, but make sure polluters in disadvantaged communities are prioritized. Prioritize residents of disadvantaged communities when recruiting and training for green jobs. Enlist the BIPOC community members when planning job training programs. Support economic incentives to grow green industries with green supply chains and green in-state jobs. Support state incentives for builders to purchase green products, maybe squeeze in a requirement or two when no one is looking, because I really don't like this idea of no requirements. And reject cryptocurrency mining. It's a bad thing. Support carbon sequestration in green products, but reject carbon capture and storage. It doesn't work well, and fossil fuel interests are using it to stall decarbonization. In the future, it'll likely play a role in decarbonizing, but right now it's a scam. And that's what I got.